Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So my talk is titled The Story of Change. So I wanted to start by asking everybody a question. How many of you have heard of Mulan? Yeah? How many of you have watched the 1998 Disney cartoon starring Ming-Na Wen as Mulan and Eddie Murphy as Mushu? Great. So growing up in Singapore in the 90s, I wasn't allowed to watch a lot of TV. And back then, there was no internet as well. So I remember very clearly, one day my father brought home some VCDs, okay? So these were the precursor to DVDs. And one of them told a story of a Chinese girl, and she bucks marriage, and she goes off to fight the war, and she fights with the Xiongnu, and then she ends up saving the emperor, and then also she finds a husband. So it kind of all works out for her in the end. And that is the story of Mulan. So, even at 8, I kind of knew, okay, so the story of Mulan, Mushu, and the whole gang, I knew that they weren't real. But it didn't really matter because her story changed my life. She told me that it was okay to be kind of different and also kind of lost because there was a world out there that was bigger than exams, bigger than bullying, bigger than Singapore even. Many years later, I was working in Northwest Chicago at this theater company, and the theater company's mission is to tell stories of US migrants. I was talking to my friend David, the artistic director. And so, I kind of said, hey, David, I kind of have a question. I don't really understand why illegal immigrants should be given citizenship. What I didn't say was, okay, so I worked really hard to get my student visa, right? And then my subsequent work visa after that. If I were to apply for US citizenship, I would have to pay a lot of money. I would have to go through a really difficult application process. And then on top of that, I would wait years and years and years before my application was approved. So why is it that other people won't have to do that? And so David told me a story. There was a Polish woman, and in 1979, she was sent across to the US by a family. And they told her, go over there, earn some money, send it back to us. But also, actually, secretly, they were trying to get her away from the violence, from the increasing violence from the Soviet regime. And so when she was in Chicago, she met another Polish immigrant, and they had 2 baby daughters. But before they could apply for amnesty and their green cards, her husband suddenly died. And then in the confusion, they moved houses, and she lost all her paperwork, and she missed the window to get her green card. And as a result, she didn't manage to go home to Poland for the next 39 years. In my time working at that company, I heard a lot of stories like that. Stories where parents would have to send their kids over the border because they could no longer afford to raise them where they were. Or other stories where whole families risk deportation simply because they want to build a better life for the people they love. Here's a picture of some of the work that I did with them. So, because I was born in Singapore, and I'll hopefully never have to flee my country or fear for my loved ones. Hopefully, like most of you here, I'll never have to fear things like tyranny or war or violence or, maybe even poverty. But through these kinds of stories, I learned empathy and I learned compassion. Because I can kind of see that if I were in their shoes, I might have made the same choices. And so these narratives shaped me and changed who I became. Today, I work in theater as a visual stage designer. So I use storytelling to address social issues and climate change. So my job is to take something that's on a page, like a script, and I put it on a stage, much like this one. and I create worlds using space, light, and video. So I like to think that I can create nostalgia for a place that you've never been to, or maybe sadness for a mom that you've never met. So some examples. If you were in this theater with me, you might feel like you were transported to 1950s in the US in Little Rock, Arkansas. And you can see this image over here. You might feel like you're part of a mob protesting that black and white children should not be educated together. Or if you were in this room with me, you might get to feel like you were meeting Ah Fong Moy. She was the first female Chinese immigrant to the US, but you might also feel her claustrophobia because she was exhibited as a curiosity as part of a traveling circus. Or maybe someone closer to home. This guy's name is Jeff, and he is struggling with eco-guilt. He's struggling with whether or not he can balance doing good and doing right by his family. So you can see his mom over there. The amazing thing about art and stories is that they can expose us to conflicts and struggles that we haven't been aware of. And they can also cause us to reflect on our values, or maybe even restructure our beliefs. But even as my colleagues and I work to humanize societal issues, we are also aware that there are much larger and more macro stories at play. So actually, in fact, if you think about it, most of the way that we organize ourselves as humankind arguably started as a story, theory, or dream. So I'll give you some examples. Monarchy. What's the story here? The story is that God has given the king or the emperor the divine right to rule. Or maybe communism. Capitalism is evil, and we should all own and produce everything collectively. Even the idea of democracy, that everybody is equal and that we all have an equal voice in deciding who governs, that is also a story. The idea of a republic, right, it's not new, but before the 1800s, it wasn't commonplace. Empires, unfortunately, were the dominant and very effective way of governing, and those lasted for over 2,500 years. So when Sun Yat-sen was telling this story, when he dreamt of China, not as a monarchy, but as a republic, he was actually telling a story of what China could and did become. And that is what makes, stories can be dangerous because they're very compelling. They might cause us to believe in something. Irving Goffman called it framing. What is framing? This idea that our stories are mental picture frames, that we use stories to organize our confusing jumble of life experiences. But that means that stories can also be used to not only foster peace, but also incite war. In the last few years, we keep hearing all these stories about the rise in nationalism, in xenophobia, and of strongman figures. I was in the US during the pandemic, and this was certainly true. People were weaponizing the coronavirus origin story to create hate and fear of Asians. So, because these narratives, right, are very convenient, they might cause, for a politician, it's very easy to create this other that you can blame everything on, because it's a surefire path to re-election. So my question is, if repeating stories not only creates, but also reinforces their reality, what are the stories that we've told ourselves so many times that they've come true? Every time we hit reshare, are we making a story real, not only about the world, but also about ourselves? Consider the classic storytelling tropes. you have the chosen one over here on one side. And then on the other side, you have an evil overlord. So let me tell you, all of us are the heroes in our own story, right? No one ever wakes up in the morning and says, I'm Voldemort, right? So what are the kinds of stories that we might be telling ourselves? You might say, I'm a knight. I'm defending the helpless and the poor. Or maybe you're the misunderstood warrior, fighting for a cause that no one else understands. Or you might even be the unlucky victim, right? Cast in an unfair lot in life. But let me ask you this. So, no one actually really likes the 1%, right? But do you think that, for example, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or, Mark Zuckerberg, do you think they wake up in the morning and they say, oh, today I'm going to be Darth Vader or Lex Luthor or even, Macbeth? And one of the really interesting things about humans is that our inner realities are a mix of our perception and actual reality. So this means that, we can hold opposing ideas at the same time, this idea of cognitive dissonance. So how many of you have a friend, who says, yeah, I have no money today, I have no money, but then they also always go overseas on vacation? Yeah? Or, you might have a friend who says, yeah, I'm very busy, I have no time to do anything. But yet, that friend is also the one who's continually adding more work and taking more projects. Yeah, so, that's kind of me. So, one of the things that I realized in doing my research, I came back to Singapore and I really wanted to use art to talk about climate change. And so, as I was doing my research, I came across this book with this quote. It says, we are told a story of scarcity and economy, where modern capitalist societies, however richly endowed, dedicate themselves to the proposition of scarcity. Inadequacy of economic means is the first principle of the world's wealthiest peoples. What is scarcity? Scarcity is this mindset that we lack something, or maybe we have a perceived lack of something. And that kind of short-circuits our brain because we then prioritize our short-term needs over maybe our more effective long-term goals. It means that if we keep telling ourselves that we will never have enough, then no matter how rich we get, then we will truly never have enough. Some of you might be familiar with this graph. So for the last 70 years, countries have used this idea of GDP, or national output, as a primary measure of progress. Right? So this pursuit of growth is very necessary to pull countries out of poverty. But at the same time, this idea has also been used to justify things like extreme income inequality, as well as unprecedented destruction of the planet. And I came across this book called Donut Economics. So in it, this economist, Kate Raworth, she actually proposes a different story. So instead of telling ourselves a story of infinite growth, we always need to grow, she says, why not let's use this idea of a donut and respect the outermost ecological boundaries of the life-supporting systems on which we depend. And why not let's advance the richness and empowerment of human life over the wealth of the economy. You might say to me, that doesn't sound very realistic. Yeah. And so in a recent Scientific American article that I was reading, there was this history of science professor, and her name is Naomi Oreskes. She's at a panel on climate change, and a prominent scientist says to her, traditional fossil fuels aren't going away anytime soon, okay? We need to be realistic. And she says, conventional realism asserts that we cannot live any other way than we do now. The fossil fuel industry asserts that we cannot live without its products. But history shows that humans have lived and thrived in many different configurations. It is not unreasonable to think that we could, in the future, live in a less destructive manner than we do now. And if that aspiration appears to be unrealistic, then we need to find strategies to make it real. Imagine telling Abraham Lincoln, be realistic, slavery will never be abolished. Or telling Gandhi, be realistic, India will never be free from the British. Or, imagine turning to your neighbor and saying, be realistic, women will never vote. My point is, in accepting realism, if we accept someone else's narrative, there will never be any space for a new or different kind of story. In order to go from passive observer to active member of civil society, we need to think about what are the stories that we're choosing to accept about ourselves and about the world, and also what role do we choose to play in those stories. To end off, I'm thinking, you might say to me, I have nothing to contribute. I have nothing to say. What can one person really do? And, I think what I'm trying to say is, that is a really paralyzing narrative. And the voice at the back of my head tells me that, all the time. But in order to, I'm thinking, if my life was a movie, right, I want to be the one who's writing the script as much as possible, right? To be a change maker, you have to take on the role of active storyteller. Envision what is possible. Surround yourself with people who love and support you. And then go out there and create the world that you want to see. That is how collective action begins, when a group of people tells the same story about a different world. And then they go out there and they make that a reality. I'm not saying that, one day you're going to wake up and, cut off your hair and, go off and fight a war and save your country. But you can start by owning the story of your destiny, and in telling that story, make change. Thank you.